Okay, so backing off, you can see the onion here, and one of the difficulties, especially when you're in a pretty small space like I am, is being able to light where you're painting and also getting good directional light on your subject. It's a little bit tough here, especially to get enough light on where I'm painting, but you want really good contrast on your object. That's really paramount. Give yourself, something to work with. Good contrast, strong lights, strong darks. Okay, so I see this onion as kind of a, look, you don't want to start with a brown. Start with a hue, a color combination that makes sense to you. We know whatever hue this is, it's dull. It's kind of a brown, but you got to start with a hue. We could say it's orange. It's maybe orange red. Certainly we see kind of dull yellows in it too. I gotta pinpoint it somewhere in terms of hues. That's where you want to start. So I'm going to start with kind of a red orange, and I'm going to take some red, lots of water, lots and lots of water. Okay, and these are convenient, but not my favorite in general for mixing. But little cups like that, you can mix and keep a lot of paint in there. So that mixed with, that's a cadmium red. If we're mixing something towards orange, we definitely want cadmium red and cadmium yellow. Okay, and I'm kind of going to mix my strongest saturation that I can see first. It's not going to be quite this strong. Strongest saturation first, right? Yeah, right. So that's kind of an orange, maybe a little bit towards red. So I'm going to dull that with a blue, maybe a little bit towards green. So it might make sense to use, if it's a blue a little bit towards green, it's going to make more sense to use cerulean than ultramarine here. So I'm going to use cerulean to dull it. See what I get, you can always kind of adjust as you go. Yeah, that's not bad. Pretty muddy. But, an object like an onion, that's an onion's middle name is muddy. It's really hard to pinpoint some colors. If you find, you're getting away from it, you need a little bit more saturation. Again, think about your strongest color that you're seeing in it. And I could maybe add a little bit more red back in. Maybe, on the other hand, you think it's a little bit too far from yellow and you need more yellow. Same thing. Once you have a little bit of the complement there, and again, you can always shift the complement. Like if I go more towards yellow in this case, right? And I'm pushing it to more of an orange, let's say towards yellow. That would be a blue towards violet. So that would mean adding maybe a little bit of ultramarine. instead of cerulean. Again, just kind of knowing a basic color wheel, where your basic pigments are, that's really important. That's it. Okay, so brush in my right hand, paper towel in my left. I'm gonna start kind of with my most saturated tones here. Then I'm gonna work darker and duller on top of that. And I'm also gonna be as general as I can to start off and gradually get more specific. So right now, these are my 3 brightest tones: light, middle, shadow, most saturation. And I'm gonna kind of work from my highlight, kind of just painting around the highlight right now. And I want to keep kind of as much paint on that paper as I can starting off. So we want to keep things going. Don't really want it to dry too much anywhere. Don't want to get too dark either. So we'll kind of fill in around that light area. And again, use plenty of paint. Use plenty of paint. Take a little bit of a wet brush, soften this. Right? Now, let's take our middle tone, plenty saturated, lots of water, and we're going to work around that shape. Keep those edges from hardening up. You know, if you wait too long, those edges will harden, and you won't really be able to get them back, or get them as soft as you really need them to be. So I'm just going to work around at this point. And when I get to a certain point and I know I'm definitely in shadow, I'm gonna roll over to that. Remember, I'm trying to get my most saturated color down. And in some places I have a reflected light where I don't really want to put just really saturated color, and I'll come back to that. So now let's grab this darker shadow. I go to that edge right away because I do not want that edge drying on me. Again, the more you can get done kind of quickly, initially, you can give yourself a really good base for all the other work that you do. And right about there is where it stops. The core of the shadow, that is. So now I also have mixed a little bit of a cooler tone here. I'm going to add some water. See if I can work this in. This is just a little bit of a duller brown, and maybe even cooler in that reflected light. That's a little bit too much paint. If you put too much paint down like that, like I didn't want to put that much paint down, started to spread, you know, just squeeze the paint out of your brush. Don't panic. Squeeze the paint out of your brush. And pick some of that paint up. You know, that's all I did just now. I just squeezed my brush and picked up some of the paint. Okay, so that reflected light is a whole different animal, and you kind of sometimes in the very beginning have to handle it differently. Now remember that one video I showed you where the guy went back in with a dry brush and picked up some paint? Here we go. Okay. Now this is kind of early for this kind of thing, but you know, you can do it at any point really. I'm just going to give that reflected light a little bit more definition. And I could do the same thing over here. I'm not going to worry about it too much. But that's a start. So this start is critical. And I did a lot of the work on the palette. Really mixing those colors, and whatever you do on the palette, I mean, there might be cases where you think the color's too strong. You know, you have to try it out on paper. So I'll usually pick a spot and just test things. You also should notice by now that when you put color down, it looks a little bit more saturated on your palette than it does when it goes on the paper. That's because it spreads out and mixes with the white of the paper. It's going to look more concentrated. It is more concentrated on the palette. And, you know, that's why when you put it down, it's softer. It's not as saturated. It's just not as concentrated. You can, you know, you keep that in mind when you're mixing. So being able to do that fairly quickly is important. And now we can work back over it. Keep in mind, I mixed a cool, dull, you know, version of what we're working with. You can see where I lifted up some paint. I'm gonna put a cool shadow right next to this, just so we deal with the bottom of this. It's not a full still life, but when you do a study like this, you want to kind of deal with all aspects, all your edges. So let's put a cool shadow down around this. By this time, it should be pretty dry, and again, we want to use plenty of water. Plenty. And I'm just going to go, I'm actually going to go pretty far up here. And that edge that I'm leaving, I don't want to leave that way. You don't want to leave a white edge there. But I'm gonna let this shadow kind of drift up there. It sort of does that. The perspective I'm looking at it from. This is kind of a shadow on the purple side of cool. And I'm doing that on purpose so that I can get a little bit of reflected color in there too. So So that might be our soft edge up there. Let's use just a wet brush. Just with that wet brush, I can kind of soften that edge of the shadow. And with just a wet brush, I'm going to soften this too. Okay, so that gives us a real soft shadow. We want to get in a little bit darker in certain places where maybe the shadow is strongest, and particularly right here. So I'm actually just going in with the same paint while it's wet and just putting down more, and eventually, you know, what you end up with is just something a little bit more concentrated. If you feel like, yeah, you know, that's not quite as cool as I want it to be in those areas, you know, try just taking the same paint, and I'm going to take, yeah, I don't like mixing in these little cups. Yuck. But I'm just going to take a little bit of ultramarine blue and go in there. Not pure ultramarine blue, but it's a little bit dulled, you know. But just drop some blue in there. Emphasize the contrast a little bit. Now here, kind of on the bottom, that's where it gets tricky, because, you know, again, this is where you're showing the object, you know, this kind of sitting, and you actually want to keep this edge pretty soft. And one of the things that you can do is just, you know, wet both sides of the edge a little bit. Let this paint drift down. And you can drop a little bit of paint in, you know. But you kind of want that edge to get a little lost. That's what's going to ground the object. You know, here eventually we're going to have an edge that pops, because this shadow isn't that dark, and actually this side of the onion will be the darker side of the edge. Right here, you want it soft. You want both sides of the edge, the onion, and basically this, you know, lighter part of the shadow to actually meet, so there isn't really a strong edge there at all. Okay, so I've given it a few minutes, let it dry. I like that little bit of blue there. Sometimes you kind of see that I'm exaggerating, you know, and I think wherever you can exaggerate, do it, you know, make the contrast more brilliant and so on. Sometimes when a cool, you know, area of color like a shadow comes up against something warmer, you'll see that cool color kind of emphasized, and vice versa. You know, that can get a little bit stronger on the warm side too. Sometimes that's called simultaneous contrast. But now what I want to do is, let me pull this over so you can see it. I'm taking my dark down here, and this is what I put in there. I'm gonna darken it just a little bit more with some ultramarine, so I get something even darker. Okay, my water's getting pretty dirty. Again, I'm choosing ultramarine because I just want it to get a little bit deeper, a little bit darker, maybe even, you know, definitely kind of moving towards violet. Remember, this is red-orange, so it's moving in that cooler direction. I'm going to use a different brush now too, because I'm going to get more specific. And this is where you really do start to pull out the texture. As I go into places and pull out kind of more of the darkest darks, you know, by kind of painting on top of the shadow, that's where I'm actually going to start to pull out the texture. So I might start up here and think about kind of following a shape down. Look for whatever you can in terms of like where the darkest part of the shadow ends. And I'm going to go pretty much all the way down to where that ends. Going a little bit more, just a little bit more blue, right? And I want to leave some lighter areas there. This is kind of how the shadow really starts to define the texture to some extent. And that's where you can kind of start to pull things out. Start to define some things a little bit more specifically. I'm going to drag some of this down a little bit. And then up here, same thing. We do have a little bit of shadow even up there. And I'll go a little bit darker on that edge. Again, I want to push that edge pretty dark. That's the darker side of the edge. This is the core of the shadow right here. And we start to get a little bit of that texture also. Now also kind of over here I have a little bit of a shadow where the skin's peeling. And I'm going to explore that a little also. I might have to pick that up a little. But we can soften that edge a little bit. That edge kind of follows right along here. Jumps to a pretty dark right around there. So I'm going to put a darker dark in, right? You know, and okay, before it could have just looked like an old orange, you know? As you start to just put a little bit of texture in, you start to get the sense that it's an onion, you know? It doesn't necessarily take that much. You can kind of use a shorthand, so to speak, with the texture, and I'm going to get more texture in there, but this is kind of just to show you it doesn't, you know, it doesn't demand putting down everything you can see. It's kind of about, you know, capturing what you need to capture to kind of bring out the onion in it. Now, next we kind of do the same thing with our middle value, although I'm probably going to mix my my dark and my middle value together. So I'm going to take this dark, right? My middle value, probably a little bit more middle value. And again, carefully, I'm going to kind of do the same thing and just carry it over further. So, you know, and this is kind of why I recommended the onion, or you're doing the onion first. It's not nearly as complicated as you can get. It's easier than a lot of things to kind of summarize and get a sense of. A lot of things, you know, taking on a head of lettuce, or, you know, all kinds of stuff, a lot easier. I mean, this is a lot easier than that. So you can kind of get into as much detail as you want with something like this, and keep in mind, if you drag down, you know, some texture into here, you may have to change what you have on the brush a little bit, change the color of it to some extent, you know. I'm going to spread that out a little bit. So we'll come up alongside of this. And again, you know, I'm not really a fast painter when it comes to watercolor. I can do it, but it's not my tendency. I think, you know, it comes natural sometimes to others, and if it does, you know, more power to you, because I envy people that can paint faster than I can with watercolor. Now I'm just kind of, as I paint, you know, just taking a wet brush whenever you want to. You can soften, blend things, get things to make a little bit more sense. You know, you can carry that further, and you start to get a feel for different things that obviously have a pattern to them, right? And you don't want to overdo that, though, you know, getting a feel for things that have a pattern to them. The problem that can arise is your brain starts to sense a pattern, and it'll take over. Your brain will take over, and then all of a sudden you're not using your eyes anymore. Your brain is just kind of saying, ah, there's a pattern, grabs onto it. Next thing you know, you're just kind of like making lines, you know, in this pattern that your brain came up with. So be careful of that. That happens a lot. As soon as we introduce you to like more complicated stuff, your brain wants to figure out a way to kind of solve that. You know, like there's a solution. It just means drawing lines from here to here, you know, from one side to the other. Just draw lines. Well, without the observation, if you just have the lines, you kind of get something that remotely resembles an onion. Something that's maybe easy to hold in your brain for 5 minutes or so. But, you know, it isn't the same as the information that you can see. And again, you're problem solving as you go. It's not a question or a problem that you can solve. It's a series of problems that, you know, you're solving as you go. I see some kind of, you know, like I've already put down some maybe violet tones in here, and there's a little bit more I could probably get into in terms of color. If I wanted to put some more color down and let it spread out a little, I maybe could just clean this brush, right? Okay, clean that brush and then just wet an area like this, right? And you aren't going to pick up too much paint when you do that. And then I'm going to take some ultramarine blue and some alizarin crimson. Do a little bit more, right? More alizarin crimson. See what that looks like. And just put a little bit more violet in, right around here. And that's one of the ways that I can kind of add or adjust color as I go. You know, in the end, you can definitely add a lot to a painting that way. If you kind of keep the painting open to drop in some more color in one place or another. Right now I feel like I have a little bit of a problem right here. I just put that purple down, and there's a couple of spots where, you know, not here, but maybe here and here, that reflected light, some of the edges are a little hard. I'm going to take some of that purple, and what I want to do, it's kind of like fluffing a pillow. Oh, I don't want to sound like one of those watercolor people on YouTube. Fluff that pillow. So I'm just going to soften that edge and not get into the pillow talk. I think the bottom here, actually, when I look at the onion, there is kind of a hard edge under there. I want to be careful that I don't separate the bottom edge from the shadow, but actually that's not bad for reflected light. Looks a little bit better now, softening that one spot. Okay, so here's the finished study. I didn't go too much further. I just dropped a little bit more detail. Places that are transitions between kind of a light and a middle tone. Put in a lot more specifics over top. And just, you know, this isn't as much detail as maybe it looks like. There's a lot more information on that onion. So there's a few places where I'll pick up on information again. It's mostly transitions in those middle tones. Let it go in other areas, like your shadow, your lightest areas. Pick up on it where you have strong contrast, like here, through there. Your middle tones. And that's about it for the study. Yippee!